listening to the Art of Homeschooling podcast, where we help parents cultivate creativity and connection at home. I'm your host, Jean Miller, and here on this podcast, you'll find stories and inspiration to bring you the confidence you need to make homeschooling work for your family. Let's begin. Hello, and welcome to episode 98 here on the Art of Homeschooling podcast. And today you are in for a special treat because in this episode, I'm talking with my dear friend, Janet Kramer, all about why we love Monarch butterflies. Welcome, Janet.
Thank you, Jean. I can't tell you what a joy it is to be able to talk with you today about monarch butterflies, one of my favorite topics.
I know, it's just going to be so much fun. I'm really looking forward to our conversation because we both have such a passion for raising monarch butterflies. And you're the one who introduced me to this whole process, to this whole activity. Let's just start off with why we love it so much. Like, what do you love about raising monarch butterflies?
So part of this is looking back, right? Based on all these years, 25 years ago, my neighbors introduced me to it. So I think it's the ability to observe one of nature's many miracles and to participate a little bit, to feel like we're doing something. It was also because my son I was homeschooling him and wanted very much to introduce him to nature. And this was a beautiful way to do that.
Yeah. Oh, I just love that. For me, it's all about that transformation. I just think it's so magical to watch. And what you mentioned about observation is such an important skill, actually, for children to learn. And yet, that seems like just a bonus, right? Because the actual experiencing this teeny tiny egg that grows eventually into this big fat caterpillar and then makes this beautiful chrysalis, and out comes a butterfly. I mean, every time I feel so in awe of this beautiful transformation. So, yeah, thank you for introducing me to it. It's so exciting. And we'll talk more at the end of the episode here about some resources for all of you listeners. But we are helping. And I'll share a little bit more about how we can help even more, right? With protecting the environment for the butterflies and then also participating in other ways. So we will get to that. But I agree with you. I think raising monarchs is such a great family activity. And also for us as homeschoolers, it's always been like, we know summer has arrived, right? Here in northeastern Ohio, when we start seeing the monarch butterflies, and then we begin looking for eggs on milkweed plants. And so we're going to talk about that whole process of how you do it here in just a minute. But there's just one more thing that I love about it. I don't remember the first year. So we've been doing it maybe for 20 years, right? And in my family, and Janet and I both have grown children now, right? And so we're still raising butterflies.
I can't help myself. Honestly, when I come across milkweed, I have to check the bottom of the leaves to see if I find any eggs. And if I do, I got to bring them in and protect them from any of the many predators out there that eat the eggs.
Yeah, that's so great. But one of the things I love the most that I just want to be sure to mention is that bright green emerald chrysalis that has these little gold dots and it looks painted, it's just so otherworldly.
It's so beautiful. It looks like a jewel, like a gem, a gemstone, something that I would like to make into earrings or something like that.
Wouldn't that be be fun to have emerald
Yeah.
green chrysalis earrings. I love that idea.
What I also want to mention is the sense of community, because
Mm.
it was, I said, my neighbors introduced me to it. And then it turns out there are half a dozen households, families on my street that grow milkweed and collect eggs, raise butterflies. And it has been a neighborhood event for me.
I love that. I love that. So remind me, because I can't even remember now. I think it was a neighbor, but when were you introduced to this? And who introduced you to raising monarchs?
So it's a good story. My neighbors, Nancy and Don, first showed me about it. And they have a son the same age as my son. So, we were always talking about what we could do, activities with our kids. And Don mentioned that he read about doing this from Ranger Rick. That's a kids magazine from the National Wildlife Federation. And
Yes.
so he learned about it from Ranger Rick, and then they started doing it. And then, I started. It was easy enough. There's plenty of milkweed around here.
Mhm.
And then of course we planted more, and it propagates pretty easily. So
Yeah.
yeah, but it was 25 years ago when my son was, 2 or 3 that we started doing this.
Yeah. So I have 3 kids, and we started, the boys were probably almost 8, 9, somewhere in there, but it was right around when Lila was born. So that would be 23 years for us, and 22, 23, somewhere in there. And at first, we didn't have any milkweed in our yard, right? But I knew that monarchs only lay their eggs on milkweed plants because that's what the caterpillar, when it emerges from the egg, that's what it needs to eat. And so I remember early on when we would go to these, we always had a back to homeschool, or not back to school. That's what it was called. Not back to school beach party the day after Labor Day every year for a big homeschooling group. And there's milkweed along Lake Erie. So around the Great Lakes, there is a lot of milkweed. And so I knew you were doing this. And so that's actually where I started looking for eggs, just out of curiosity.
And at first it's easy to mistake other little nicks and things on the milkweed for eggs. So it takes a practiced eye to realize what is an egg and what isn't an egg.
Yeah.
I remember running over to my neighbor with leaves saying, is this one? Is this one? And he's like, nope, nope, nope. Yes.
That is great, because I remember bringing some in thinking they were eggs, and then nothing would happen,
Right.
and then or bringing something in and then it moved. It's like, oh, that's a tiny little bug. It's not an egg.
Right.
So yeah. So let's talk about what the process is. Like, how do we raise monarchs, and what it's been like for each of us over the years. So do you want to start?
Sure. And honestly, there's no one right way. I think many people do it differently, whatever suits them. But as recommended by Nancy and Don, I would take the leaf on which I found the egg off of the milkweed stem and lay it on a tray with some wet paper towel and loosely covered with plastic so the leaf wouldn't dry out. And then wait. And sometimes you have to wait even 5 days, 6 days, because if you get the egg right after it's laid, it takes a while until the caterpillar hatches. And so then once it's so tiny, I mean, it's really tiny. It's so tiny, you almost need a magnifying glass to see it. Yeah. I wait a while and let it eat the milkweed the leaf that it's on, and get big enough, at which point I will transfer it to another stem of milkweed or stalk that I've taken out of the garden and put in water in a jar, vase of water. And I usually will either lay the leaf on one of those leaves, or maybe even kind of tear around the caterpillar. So I just have a tiny little piece of leaf with a caterpillar on it and lay that on the bigger milkweed stem. And then the caterpillar knows what to do. It does its own thing.
Well, so I just want to say that I often find it easier to see the egg than to see the tiny caterpillar because the egg, yes, is very, 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 very small. I mean, it's smaller than a grain of rice. It is so small, right?
Right.
But it's white against the green leaf, right? And you always find them on the not always, every once in a while I found one on top, but it's almost always on the underside of the milkweed leaf. But when
And
the
sometimes on the
caterpillar,
flower too. Sometimes you will
oh,
find them on the flowers, but you're right, mostly on
yeah,
the underside.
yeah. But that tiny caterpillar, it just, I mean, you really need to leave it alone and let it grow a little before you can really even identify it as a caterpillar.
You know, right before it's about to hatch, it looks like a little black pinhead because it's
Yes.
almost like you see the nose of the caterpillar coming out. And many times I'll check the egg and think, oh my God, it disappeared. Where'd it go? You know, and it's just, you have to have faith. And then it
For
appears
sure.
again. But it's really cool actually to look at one of the just hatched caterpillars with a magnifying glass because you can see those stripes.
From the very beginning. Isn't that
Yes.
amazing? So a monarch caterpillar has these very distinct stripes that are absolutely beautiful. And from the very beginning, you can see it. Yeah, so true. All right, so let's talk stage by stage. So I used to do it that way too, and bring just one leaf in and put it on a wet paper towel. And now I don't know when I switched, but I've started bringing, usually I think because I often have multiple caterpillars in my little habitat at once. So I just bring the stock in from the get-go and put it in a little vase of water. But it does make it difficult to see. You have all these leaves, and if you have caterpillars of varying sizes, it can be kind of hard to find them.
So something else that I didn't realize until more recently, and my neighbor confirmed, is that sometimes they cannibalize themselves. Like a bigger caterpillar might eat a smaller one. Maybe it's unintentional. Maybe it's just eating the leaf and it accidentally eats the caterpillar. I don't know. But I used to keep close count of my caterpillars, my eggs, my caterpillars, and everything. And then if one disappears, then maybe it
Yeah.
was eaten. That's,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah. And so let's talk like what kind of enclosure. So we're bringing these in the house. I'm going to give a little caveat to that in just a moment. But what do you put those stalks of milkweed in?
Yeah. So that's evolved, right? It
Yeah.
started out in a big aquarium with a screen lid. That's how my neighbors do it. And I started doing that. But I realized that they really like height because the stalks are tall. And we'll talk about the next stage when they form their chrysalis. They like to crawl up. So
Yeah.
there was a time when my screened in porch was my caterpillar, what?
Habitat.
Nursery habitat, right? And I actually did not have them in a cage at all. And I just had a table with multiple vases filled with milkweed and caterpillars at all various stages, and soon chrysalises as well. And they were kind of free to roam in this screened in porch area. And we'll get to that. There's some funny stories associated with that. But more recently, I decided to build a cage. I've read, and this might be the caveat you were going to talk about, that you don't want to raise them inside because
Yes.
they need to be exposed to all the natural elements they would be if they were outside to just develop appropriately. So I had these old screens from windows, and I built a cage that's tall as the window screens with a piece of wood across the top so that there's a flat surface where they can form their chrysalises. And the two sides, I just took some screen and put Velcro, the sticky Velcro on it, and then it sticks on both sides. So I can open it easily, change the milkweed out, and put the screen back. The point of the screens is to keep the predators out.
I love that. So I did just learn this recently. I mean, I've heard over the past few years about the importance of them being outdoors, and I've still brought them into our kitchen. It's right by a window. Well, first I will say that the caveat is that they are stronger if they are raised outside. And I've learned that even more specifically recently from an organization called Monarch Watch. The organization is really involved in education, conservation, and research all about monarch butterflies because their population has dwindled and the goal is to build it back up. The way I learned this about raising them outdoors is from their tagging program. They now have a monarch tag. You can buy monarch tagging kits from them as part of this citizen science program and tag monarchs, but they don't want you tagging any that are raised indoors because their likelihood of making it all the way to Mexico is lower having been raised indoors. That's how they've discovered that. So I just find that really interesting. And so now my project, Janet, is going to build a habitat like yours so
Oh,
that
cool.
that I can keep outside. So I'll just quickly say we too started with a tank. I think it had been a lizard tank, right? My boys had some lizards. And so it was just an extra tank with a screen lid. And we started there. And then Brian got me, it's a collapsible sort of netted butterfly habitat that's taller. It's about 3 feet tall and probably 2 feet, foot and a half, 2 feet wide. And it's been really nice. It's just sets on a tabletop or a countertop, but I'm going to build one. I'm inspired to build an outdoor setting for them. So what's next? So the caterpillars then, it's funny to go and read the Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carle because they really are like that. They devour these caterpillars, just eat and eat and eat.
But it's just milkweed. And that's where,
Yes.
If you're going to do this, you have to commit to providing fresh milkweed. There have been times when a whole stalk has been completely devoured and it's just a bare stalk. And I remember one summer giving some caterpillars to a friend who didn't have a supply of milkweed. And so I remember one night, probably, 10 o'clock, it was in the dark, and she lives in a different community. So we met at a library parking lot halfway in between. And I gave her milkweed. It looked like we were up to something clandestine, something bad, but it was so funny. It was just milkweed for her caterpillar.
Yeah. I remember late at night before we had it in our yard, and I think you would give me eggs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I would need to keep the milkweed stocked. And I remember one night also late at night, I knew this one spot at the edge of a field nearby, by a park near us where milkweed grew. So I remember it was also like 10 p.m. or something like that. Like, I know they can't make it until morning. I have to go out and procure some milkweed right now.
One more thing, I just want to add that if your listeners are reading about this, the caterpillar is the larva stage. And sometimes I think of larva as something, I don't know, like maggots or, awful things. And it is the larva stage of this development.
Yeah.
But then once the caterpillar hatches and gets big and becomes, like you say, a big, fat, juicy caterpillar, I mean, the size of your pinky probably, it's time for it to form a chrysalis. And it knows, what I have found is they like a protected spot. So if they can, they crawl up. I've just noticed they go as high as they can. Yeah. But sometimes when they were on my porch, I found them everywhere. These are some really funny stories about where these caterpillars would decide to form their chrysalises.
Oh my gosh.
Under chairs, under tables. Once there was one, our sofa, our little, couch or love seat on the porch, it's a cloth one. It was soft cushions. One cushion hung a little bit from the seat, and there was a chrysalis underneath the cushion.
Oh,
I mean, it was in the front of the couch. And then another time I just had random things on my table, like a plastic cup with a plastic spoon in it. And I found a chrysalis, well, first a caterpillar, I should say. It forms a J. What it does is sew a button from its behind, and the back two legs attached to this button, and it hangs upside down and curls up like a J. So I would find those J's before it forms the chrysalis on the spoon. I found one on the end of the plastic spoon. And wouldn't you know it, the next day, there was another one right beside it. So,
oh my gosh.
I'll send you that picture. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
Hilarious.
Yeah. So we, in our little enclosure, right, we would put, even this year, I just have 2 chrysali left right now. A butterfly emerged yesterday morning. You know, I add sticks in there. Sometimes they've jade and formed their chrysalis underneath a leaf. But they often crawl up to the very top of this netting and do their J from there. So like you said, they do generally like to crawl up, and they then hang upside down. They form this shape of a J, and then they turn into the bright green, emerald green chrysalis.
So let's talk about that process for a minute, though, because I feel so privileged to have had the time to observe that transformation. And it takes place about 24 hours after they form the J. And its chrysalis emerges from within the caterpillar. It's different than moths that spin cocoons. This is not a cocoon. This is a chrysalis, and it comes from within the caterpillar. It's as if the skin unzips. You see it split. And then the green blob emerges from that split skin, and the skin itself just shrivels up. The green blob kind of wriggles around to make the dry skin drop off if it can, and then it hardens into that beautiful emerald green chrysalis.
Yeah. So I will tell you a funny story is that this year at the beginning of August, for the very first time, so I've been doing this 20 plus years, I got to see that process. And I was on the phone. It's so funny because I was working on planning the Taproot teacher training that I host. And I was on the phone with one of the presenters, my friend Jody, who does the music at Taproot. And it was happening like, wait, Jody, I have to call you back. You'll never believe what's happening. And I went and watched it. And then I came back and finished my conversation with her. And one of the books I'm going to share at the end is about butterflies. And I was using that book as part of one of the workshops I was presenting at Taproot this year in 2022. So I took my butterfly habitat to Taproot, and the caterpillar that I saw form its chrysalis is the one that emerged on the Saturday morning of the Taproot weekend this year. So that was really magical, really a wonderful thing. So let's talk about when they come out as butterflies.
That process is probably a couple weeks later. I haven't exactly measured, but my sense is it's between 10 and 14 days from when they form a chrysalis.
Yeah, and that's you'll read that is the general time frame.
And you'll know that it's soon because that beautiful green chrysalis becomes transparent.
Yeah.
It looks like it turns black, but really it's clear, and what you're seeing are the folded up wings of the butterfly inside.
Yeah.
And you know it's coming. You can see it. But again, unless you have time to just sit and watch it. There have been times when I have done that, just sat and watched and trained my video, my phone to videotape it. And then I get impatient and I walk away. And then I come back and wouldn't you know, it had emerged. I missed it.
Yeah, isn't it crazy?
Such a quick process.
I walked into the other room.
Right.
Back. the butterfly. Yeah.
It takes place so quickly that it's like the shell. The chrysalis is just a clear, almost plastic looking shell that cracks open, and it's like a birth. The way the
Yeah.
butterfly slips out, there's a little bit of fluid there that comes out,
Mhm.
and it's looks so distorted because its body has been in that, looks like embryo shape, right? And then its legs have to kind of grab onto the old chrysalis, and it takes a couple hours for the fluid to pump from its abdomen into its wings, for its wings to spread out, and for them to dry. And all that
Mhm.
whole process, they really need to be left alone to be able to
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah, and they sometimes they flutter a little bit, or sometimes they just sit really still once they've pumped up their wings to their like full size, and while it's drying, sometimes they just sit. And one of the fun things in our family, so my kids have all had the experience, right, of releasing them. So when they crawl, you put your finger inside the wherever the little habitat, and the butterfly will crawl on your finger, and it really tickles, I think. And then you can go outside and release it, or if you're already outside, that's what we're going to try to do from now on. But you let the butterfly go, and then in our family we always say bye bye butterfly.
That's so cute.
I know. I mean, since my kids were really little. So that's such a fun process. And it really every time is magical. And I do also think there's something amazing about doing it year after year after year. Has become, in both of our families, such a tradition. And it's just like a part of the seasons,
Yeah.
our experience of the seasons.
I would say that mostly, I haven't read a whole lot, but most of what I've learned has just been from observation. And
Yes.
you mentioned that sometimes the caterpillar will form its chrysalis on the leaf itself, on the stalk of a milkweed. And later, when I've been throwing those stalks out, I notice the leaf is secured to the stalk with some of that webbing, that like the caterpillar will secure the leaf because it will turn yellow and die. But I'm always surprised why or have been surprised, why it doesn't fall off. And and that's why, because the caterpillar already secured it to the
Isn't that
stalk.
incredible that they know instinctively to do that?
Yeah.
So I would just love to share some funny stories. So when you were talking about, all the different places you would find the jays or the chrysalli. So, when you're first bringing them the milkweed in and the caterpillars are small, it doesn't seem necessary to cover the whatever they're in, right? And so we now keep them in the kitchen by the kitchen windows, but we would keep these in our dining room, which is where we did most of our homeschooling, right? Living room, dining room. And we kept them there because it was fun to watch them while we were doing our homeschooling activities. And so one year we had replenished the milkweed, and I thought all the caterpillars in there were really small. I didn't realize one of them was getting quite large and ready to jay and then turn into a chrysalis. And so we went to bed, and the lid was off the tank. And I got up in the morning, and I was looking for a book so there's a doorway into the kitchen, right? An open doorway. And the tank was on the sideboard to the left of the doorway, and to the right of the doorway was a bookshelf. And so I was getting a book off the bookshelf in the morning for our lessons. And I look up, and there's the J on the very top shelf of this very
Oh
tall
gosh.
bookcase. And I thought, oh no, we left the tank open. What am I going to do? Because then you realize, well, at that point, you can't move them,
Right.
right? That's where it's going to be for the next 2 weeks. And then a butterfly is going to come out. And hopefully we will be there when that happens so we could let it outside. So it all worked out just fine. But I do remember toward the end, I knew to look for it darkening, right? The chrysalis darkening when you can begin to see the butterfly inside. So then I was watching it like a hawk, right? I mean, I'm watching it constantly so that when it did emerge, before it started flying around our house,
Right.
I could get it outside.
We've had those experiences in the past of having to get butterflies that were flying in our house out, because once they start flying, they're not as amenable to crawling on your finger as initially. And that's the other thing that's really funny, I think. When they first emerge, I don't think they know they're a butterfly. They're used to being a caterpillar and they crawl. I'm like, you can fly. You don't have to crawl. I'll take it out and I'll put it on a flower, and it might end up maybe on a fence or something. And instead of flying away, it crawls up.
Oh, interesting. I've never seen that. That is very funny.
I mean, if you wait long enough for them to really be ready to fly, they will fly.
Yeah.
Which you've probably done.
Well, so I just think that is such a good example of how doing this year after year, you learn more every single time. To me, that's such a great lesson, a commentary about education, because when we really get into an activity and do it regularly over a period of time and really take the time to observe. I really think that's one of the key tips here, is that so much of this is about you just learn by through observation. And then it builds up into this really rich experience that you carry with you for the rest of your life.
And it's such a great thing to share. I have to say, another neighbor just learned about it 2 summers ago, I think. And she's a fanatic. She sends her husband out looking under the milkweed around the block, all the neighbors. And last year, I think she released over 100 butterflies.
Oh my gosh.
And she names them also. She'll post on Facebook and ask for names, or she'll tell them what she named them. Oh, here's another interesting fact that we haven't talked about yet, that you can tell the difference between a male and a female.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And the males have a swelling on the lower wings that looks like along one of the black veins, just is a little bit bulge. It doesn't stick out, but it's wide. I mean,
yeah. So it's a lot of people will say, okay, there's a black dot. Look for the black dot, right? And
on each side.
Yeah, that's really fun too, to see. Oh, was it? My kids would always be like, is it a girl or a boy? And then it makes me think the same thing. It's like a birth,
Right, exactly.
Yeah, we're monarch butterfly doulas. That's what we are, Janet.
That's it.
Yeah.
That is it.
That is it.
And just to circle back to something you said at the very beginning, the transformation, the metamorphosis is such a metaphor for our own lives. I mean, there's so much deep meaning there if you want to go into it.
Yeah. So one of my favorite quotes, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here because I don't have it in front of me, but I will be sure to put it in the show notes. And it comes from Buckminster Fuller. And the quote is, there's nothing in a caterpillar that knows it's going to turn into a butterfly. And it's so fascinating to me because that transformation is often like that. Like we have a sense, but we don't know, right? We don't know what's coming. And yeah, it really is a metaphor for so many things.
So here's a funny story. There's this book called Hope for the Flowers.
Oh, I remember that book.
Do you?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out, I mean, it's odd that I first learned about it in a spiritual meditation community that I'm part of. And years later, the same neighbor that turned me on to raising monarchs in the first place showed me this book again and told me that it was another neighbor, Trina Paulus, who wrote the book. And I never knew that. So Trina didn't live here anymore, but her mother still lived here. Her mother, Alice, still lived here. And Trina's the one who wrote it. It's just, so she signed it for me. I have a signed copy, and it says, to Janet, to believe in the butterflies always.
That is so sweet. Oh, I just love that.
Yeah,
Well, let's
yeah.
let's move into resources because that's a beautiful little
It's not
story.
exactly about how to raise monarchs, though. I mean, it's a more of a it's like a metaphor for life, that
Right.
story, because in this one, even the caterpillars spin cocoons. It's not like it's a chrysalis. So
Oh, interesting.
it's
Yeah.
not really about raising monarchs.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there are some great books about raising monarchs, and listeners can find in the show notes, we'll put links to all of these resources that we're mentioning. But one I want to mention that I just came across this book one year at the library, but it's so simple and straightforward, and it has a lot of great photographs in it. And it's called How to Raise Monarch Butterflies, a step-by-step guide for kids. And it's by Carol Pasternak. And I'll put a link to that book over in the show notes.
Yeah, this one is called Butterflies for Kids by J. Dicker Norsgaard.
I will put a link to that one in the show notes too. And then I want to be sure to mention Monarch Watch because that's where I've learned more and more about protecting monarchs and butterfly conservation and also the research that's being done. You know, these monarchs migrate. This is a whole fascinating aspect too, right? So there are multiple generations of monarchs through the summer, and then the final generation is the one that migrates to Mexico. There are Eastern monarchs and there are Western monarchs, right? So there's sort of two streams of migration, and Monarch Watch is the organization in North America that is monitoring this activity and the numbers of monarch butterflies.
Something interesting that I found when I was doing some research is that there are really two distinct groups of monarchs, and the Eastern monarchs are the ones that migrate to Mexico, to
Right.
about 12 different mountain ranges in a couple of the states in Western Mexico. And it's a particular tree that they overwinter on, the Oyamel fir tree. But then the Western butterflies are those in the United States that live west of the Rockies, and they migrate to California, to the coast
Yeah.
of California.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. And they are different. I just think that that is so fascinating. But Monarch Watch, you can go to monarchwatch.org and they have so many resources. And now one of the most exciting things that they're doing, you can purchase tagging kits from them if you're interested in tagging. And it's this citizen science project. So there are ways that you can report if you find a butterfly with a tag on it. And they also have a program for you could turn your home garden into a certified monarch habitat, and they teach you how to do that. So I think that would be such a fun project to do as a family, as a homeschooling family, or any family I think would really enjoy doing that. It really just takes planting some milkweed and then having other sources of nectar for the butterflies. So that could be a really fun thing. You can actually certify your home garden if you want to. You can be part of the tagging program, and they have events and education and all kinds of other things that you might want to learn more.
I know your audience is all over the country, so people need to look at what are native pollinators in their areas.
Yes. Thank you. That is a great tip. Yeah. And listeners all over the world, actually. So,
Okay, there you go.
yeah, I know it's fun. So, one other resource I want to mention is this book so my friend Allison and I love taking a book and turning it into like a main lesson block. And we chose a book this year for our workshop at Taproot, and it's called The Girl Who Drew Butterflies. The subtitle is How Maria Marion's Art Changed Science. It's a book for we did it for grades 5 through 8. It's written by a woman named Joyce Sidman, and it is a fascinating story of a woman in the 17th century who from the time she was a little girl, loved bugs and butterflies and all kinds of, she was very nature oriented. But at that time, girls did not grow up to be scientists officially. Her father or stepfather was an artist who would paint these big paintings of flowers, and he would also often put bugs in them to make the painting look more realistic. And so she learned to paint, and then she combined her art and her scientific knowledge. And here's a fascinating thing. All of her knowledge came from observation. So she would go find bugs, eggs, chrysali, all kinds of butterflies at different stages and bring them into her house, kind of like your screened-in porch, Janet, and watch them. And one of the cool things that she learned, she was the first human to discover that certain butterflies lay their eggs on certain plants because that's what the caterpillar eats when it emerges. And nobody had ever discovered that before. It's just so interesting to me. So it's a wonderful book that could go along with, if you want to do this kind of raising monarchs as part of your homeschooling. It's a really, really wonderful book and so many things in it.
It sounds wonderful. I wish that I had had that when we were homeschooling.
I know. It's a newer book, but it has so many beautiful pictures in it too. Well, thank you everyone for listening, and do check out the show notes. You can find them at artofhomeschooling.com/episode 98, and we'll have links and some photos for you to check out. And I hope this encourages you just to be more curious, right? And maybe you'll plant some milkweed in your yard. You know, every little bit helps. And just learn more about caterpillars, butterflies, monarchs, if they're in your area. And let us know, because I would love to hear if you explore.
You know, something I'd like to branch out into in the future is swallowtails. I had the really great luck to find a swallowtail caterpillar last summer, and it overwintered, in fact, in my butterfly cage. Their chrysalises or chrysali are not as beautiful as monarchs, but when it did emerge in the spring, it was just fabulous. So, you know, there are other butterflies as well.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. The two tips I would say are, it really teaches the skill of observation without having to directly teach it. And then a wonderful metaphor for transformation and metamorphosis. So thank you so much, Janet. This has been really, really fun. I appreciate you being here and having this conversation together today.
You're so welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
That's all for today, my friend. But here's what I want you to remember. Rather than perfection, let's focus on connection. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Art of Homeschooling podcast.